Hello again, and good morning. And so we had a little glitch on the audiovisual. I think we're rolling now, and I'm going to pick up where I have left off for this session. We're continuing to look at the ontological status of the human embryo and two particular challenges to granting human personhood at the moment of conception. The two challenges are with monozygotic twinning and twin reabsorption. And then in this lecture also, we're going to look at the issues of abortion and in vitro fertilization. Okay, moving forward then, I have two little video clips here that essentially show the progression, the continuous progression of development from fertilization forward to birth, all right? And the first one is already queued here. White screen. Let's try this again, and with closed caption, so we can see the subtitles. See, with MRI, they can focus on different organ systems and then give them a contrasting color.
Or they could take out the CC now.
Sorry?
They can take out that CC.
Yes.
Or no, probably still need it, right?
Well, I'm having difficulty with the little band. This other little got stuck down there, so I don't want to fool around with it anymore. When the video stops, I'll deal with it. So the interesting thing is these are the equivalent of a photograph, but it's done with magnetic resonance, but it's live. Now, this is the birthing process, okay? Look at this. It's actually live. Amazing. We focus just the baby and the skeletal system of the mother. The baby's crowning. There's the actual birth.
He pushes off.
Pushes off from the pelvis. There's a live birth. You can still their image in the inside. Yeah. Their image in the inside. That's really cool. Amazing.
Can you move the mouse so that bar?
Yes, I was trying. Let me pull this one here. Now, finally, this thing appeared. This is what's in the way. Hopefully, the taskbar would go away now. Actually, because this little thing gets stuck. I can close this now. Yes. Okay. There we go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole biochemical communication that is occurring now. He's showing particular images. The change from embryo to fetus on the name. Yeah, the heartbeat of a human fetus is very fast, actually. One time from the sonogram, it's about 200 beats per minute. You know, boom, 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 boom. And they magnify it. It's impressive. So he's addressing mostly a secular audience with his TED Talks, but he's introducing the language of divinity and the mystery of life and the complexity that is going on. How elegant it is. Okay, so we have that link there. And this other one is shorter, but it has more emphasis, more detail on the actual fertilization process.
You find when you drive on the turnpike,
Yes?
you see a sign that says you can hear the baby heartbeat in 18 days.
18 days.
But it says here that it's like 24 hours, 24 days before the heart compartment start to develop.
Yeah, so that is also,
possible?
yes, that is also a gradual process because, you know, we have 3 different types of muscles in our body. There are the skeletal muscles, the smooth muscle, and what is known as the cardiac muscles, right? Skeletal muscles connect to the skeleton, and we have voluntary control over that. That's what moves our skeleton. And they're connected to the central nervous system. Smooth muscle is not connected to the skeleton, to bone, and is part of the involuntary nervous system, so we don't have control over it. Most of the internal organs are smooth muscle, like the stomach, intestines, and so forth. Then there's that third category of muscles, which is the cardiac muscle, and that's unique to the heart. And one unique characteristic, first of all, it's involuntary, so it's connected to the autonomic nervous system, but also these are the only cells that have a pulse. They have a beating rhythm, all right? And that beating rhythm starts at the individual cell level. And they start beating individually as soon as those the myocardial cells are formed, they start pulsing on their own. And when they start aggregating into tissue, they coordinate their pulsing and then they start pulsing together. They synchronize the pulsing when they join into the tissue that is going to become the organ of the heart. And they start pulsing together, and they continue to differentiate into the actual heart, as you saw, first starting with 2 chambers and so forth, all right? And I know what's going on here, but let me turn it off. And they coordinate that way. And so it is a gradual process. Those myocardial cells begin pulsing at about 18 days, but it takes a few more days to aggregate into the actual tissue that will become the organ of the heart, all right? So that emphasizes the point that this is a gradual process. It's a gradual process of differentiation. This other one will show also in a shorter time, like I say, emphasizing more the fertilization process. I don't know why it's called that, but it's a very good film. This one actually just has music on the background, so, and the music is kind of rock stuff, so I'm gonna shut off the music for this one. It's crazy music. Okay. Oh, hold on. I am computer challenged.
It's right there at the bottom
Today.
left of the screen.
Yeah, this one here, right?
Yeah,
that's the easiest one. Thank you. Okay. So it goes very rapidly because it's kind of actual time, but this is from the moment of ejaculation, actually, the sperm moving through into the uterus, and then through the uterus there, it's going right through the, right through the cervix. And now you see the 2 tubes. Those are the 2 fallopian tubes at the top of the uterus. And the sperm will actually go into both tubes. And now the camera is following one tube.
This is computer generated?
Yes. So these are the sperm, and now you'll start seeing further into the tube going toward the ampulla, these hair-like structures, right? They're called villi. Yeah, they're called villi, and these are hair-like structures of the cells, and they also coordinate and they move in this fashion that will move the egg down, will move the embryo down from the tube, from the ampulla, down toward the uterus itself, okay? So here are the sperm arriving toward the bottom here, the first set, and they'll start, as it were, attacking the egg, the mature egg. See how they're trying to burrow through. It will zoom into the details. You'll see the acrosome reaction in a minute. There, that's the release of enzymes and penetrating through the zona pellucida, and the cortical reaction that just happened to seal that off, that second sperm from inserting. So fertilization has happened. Here's a sperm going through the cell membrane of the egg, loses the tail. The rest of the head of the sperm disintegrates, and the two pronuclei are now fusing, syngamy. You see the first mitotic division a little fast there, because they're going to go through all 9 months actually. But here you see essentially chromatin, and chromatin is going to now replicate into distinct chromosomes, and you'll see the two sister chromatids in a minute. So this is the chromatin within the zygote. Syngamy has happened already, so it's a diploid cell, it's a new individual. Here's the DNA being spliced, and the machinery, the replication machinery. This, of course, is a diagram. We don't have that level of sophistication yet. But here are the sister chromatids lining up at the equator, migrating to the opposite poles, being pulled by, but the centromere had separated there. Now, first mitotic division is the beginning of the Madura, another mitotic division. So 48 hours have already occurred. You know, there's one mitotic division every day, every 24 hours. Another split into 8 now is the morula, continuing to migrate down. See how the villi encourage the little embryo to move toward the uterus. And at this point, this process is called hatching. Yes, it's an actual hatching. What happens is you have the little embryo developing, the late morula, early blastocyst, okay, the 2 cell layers, but that little blastocyst is still surrounded by the corona radiata and the zona pellucida. And so that little blastocyst has to come out of that shell, as it were, it's a soft shell, okay, to embed himself or herself into the uterine wall. And this is what we just saw here. It's literally a hatching process. And this could be reminiscent of our ancestry, common ancestry with other vertebrates, that the lower vertebrates that hatch, like fish, reptiles, and amphibians.
Yeah, I have to say that when in the embryological development,
Yep.
at one point,
Yes.
The fetus
Yes.
in the MRI looked just like the face of my leopard gecko.
Oh, yes.
Same shape, and the same eyes, and
Yeah.
little nostril holes.
Uh-huh.
It
And a
was-
tail.
I know what
And the
And a tail that gets reabsorbed. Right. You see? Yeah.
It was uncanny, though. I was
Yeah.
looking right at my lizard.
Yeah, you see? Right. That's common ancestry. If you take the embryonic stage of your lizard back to a very early stage, there would be that homology, that similarity, remember, in the early stages of development. Ontogeny and phylogeny. Mhm. Okay? Okay, so here goes that hatching again, which is not really known well, but it happens. There it is for mammals, okay?
And what happens to the casing?
That gets reabsorbed again, nature recycles, and that gets degenerated and reabsorbed by the tissue. Of course, that's microscopic, right? Because it's still the same size essentially as the original egg. This is right, so neurulation, that was, yes, sorry, that was the invagination of the ectoderm in through the neural groove to generate the neural tube, which will become the central nervous system and the brain. So anterior is toward the left down here, and posterior is over here. Continue with gastrulation now. You can see the somites. These somites are the segments that will become the vertebrae. You see the heartbeat very fast, okay? There's still a little yolk sac that is being reabsorbed. Let's go back for a moment. At the early stage, we share a yolk sac for a little bit. There it is. This is a yolk sac that is still feeding the vertebrate embryo. See how it's being absorbed? All the nutrition there. You see the early tail that gets also reabsorbed. The umbilical cord is establishing. Of course, beyond this is the placenta that is already established into the mother. Here is focusing on the heart itself. Very fast beat, as you can see, because the rapid growth that is occurring is going to need a lot of nutrition, okay, and getting rid of a lot of waste also, all through the umbilical cord.
A question.
Digits developing very fast. Yes.
The Yolk Sac. So
Yeah.
when I was pregnant with
Yeah.
Yolk Sac, and they did a really early ultrasound, and I found another Yolk Sac. There was no baby in there.
Okay.
They told me that it was gonna get reabsorbed, and that's it. But that means that they were
That could,
twins.
yes, that could be a twin reabsorption. Very interesting, because we're going to talk about that in a few minutes in class.
Oh.
Different types of twin reabsorption. So it could have been 2 pregnancies and one was absorbed. It could have been two fertilizations, or it could have been 1 fertilization into homozygotic twins, most likely, and one of the twins got reabsorbed. Very interesting that you mentioned that.
At that point, the doctor told me, because I got
A little nervous, yeah.
yeah. And he said that it happens a lot. I don't know if he said it just to calm me down.
Calm you
but
down.
Is that true?
It does happen. Whether it happens a lot or not is anybody's guess, because we have not MRI'd or we have not ultrasound all the pregnancies that occur, okay, that early on. But it's very interesting. In fact, if you have a copy of that sonogram, I'd be interested in having a copy of it, because I can incorporate it into the lecture. It fits in perfectly with what I'm talking about today.
I'll
All right?
Would you mind rewinding just a little bit?
Rewind, back.
A little bit?
How far back? More? You want to see the yolk sac?
Sure.
Okay, here's the yolk sac. All right, just like
There,
this is the yolk sac. You'll see it there. That's the yolk sac, the white down here. That is getting reabsorbed. You see how it's being sucked in? That's all nutrition. That's all nutrition, just like the yolk of an egg, a chicken egg, the yolk of an amphibian, a bird, a reptile. All right? That's early on, early in this.
Father John,
Yes.
We know so much about birth nowadays.
Yes?
It's ironic that we still resort to the old form instead of adopting this and seeing that this is something very special.
Yes?
Very special.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And the more science reveals to us, is the more science should be turning away from the secular thought, if you will.
Yes, it's true. In my opinion, the issue with the secular thought is that it just fast and quick gives you the quick answer. You have a problem, get rid of the problem, because technology can do it, you see?
Yeah.
Because it takes a little time to reflect and to think about this. And we don't have the time.
See, that baby is oriental.
It's like that eyes.
It's oriental, that's the eyes.
Yeah. Now watch the baby play with his umbilical cord. Oh, mom is going through all the banging inside. Get me out of here. Yeah. Mom is feeling all that. Now they slow down a little bit. Okay. Look at that guy. It's amazing.
When you eat, they just stay so quiet and happy.
Oh, yes? Okay, because they're being fed.
Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting. So amazing. See the coordination? Yeah, they can detect some light also through the belly of the mom and the eyes. You saw that it blinked a little bit, okay? So they can detect a little bit of light and darkness. But the brain itself still needs to develop further.
And they will interact with moms too. When you,
Yes.
if you probe them, right? They'll interact.
Yes, they can, right. You can have some level of communication. So this was a French film of the couple, mom and dad, and then it goes into the actual birthing process. Well, here's baby. Okay. Oh, no, there was another film that showed the actual birthing process. So basically what I wanted to show with these films is the continuous development Let me make sure that everything is on here. Let me turn back on the sound so that I can hear the students. Okay, hopefully students, you can hear me, yes?
Yep, we hear you.
Something else is going on in the background. Oh, it continues. All right, yes, because it connects one video to the other. Let's go back here. Okay, so my point with these two videos basically is that there is a continuous development. It's a continuous development from the zygote to birth that in us takes this 9 months. And that development is further and further differentiation of the cells, cell differentiation, okay? But it's all mitosis until the child actually grows and develops the sexual organs, at which time they will be considered biological adults. So some conclusions here regarding embryonic development. It is a continuous development from the zygote forward through the 9 months. And therefore, at what point do we posit, do we consider that this is a human being, a human person? Any moment after conception, after fertilization, is an arbitrary moment. What are you going to use? The heartbeat? Why the heartbeat? You know, what are you going to use? The brain, or the fact that the child can actually breathe, or that the child is sexually mature? What key point of life are you going to use to grant this human being personhood? Because every other point is going to be arbitrary. After fertilization, every other point is arbitrary. So that's my whole point with showing this embryonic development in the detail that we know it today. Moving forward then, to say that we have to talk a little bit about the soul now. I'm a little neurotic about this. I want to make sure I'm still recording. Yes, good. Still recording. Sorry. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ensoulment, right? In the human species, the soul that traditionally is defined as an individual being of a rational substance. And there's some characteristics about the soul that the soul, the human soul I'm talking about, is individual and therefore personal, and that the human soul is also simple in contrast to our body, which is not simple, is complex, is made up of parts, namely organ systems, and the systems are made up of organs are made up of tissues, etc. And so the soul is simple, indivisible, all right? It's single unit, if you will. And the soul also is eternal, the human soul, again. This is according to the Judeo-Christian tradition that this program is grounded on. And so by eternal, I mean that it has an origin because we're not God, and therefore we have to start at some point. We have a moment of creation, right? Before which we did not exist. Before our father's sperm fertilized our mother's egg, we did not exist as an individual as such, because that sperm belonged to our fathers and that egg was part of our mothers. So we have an origin, a beginning physically in time and place and in this universe, but we have no end. Now the end, we have to understand in what way I mean end, meaning that we don't have a time when we finish, all right? But rather, there's another way of understanding end as a goal. We do have a goal, which is eternal life. But I'm using the word end as when something finishes. We don't have a finish, we have an origin, and that's why we call the soul eternal. So at least these three characteristics are according to the Judeo-Christian tradition. According to this, traditionally, there have been two theories about ensoulment. That ensoulment will happen immediately at fertilization, or not immediately, then ensoulment will happen what is called delayed ensoulment, sometime after fertilization. Now, these theories actually developed in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, we certainly did not have sonograms, we did not have MRIs, we did not have microscopes. In fact, it wasn't really known well the whole theory of, or the whole reality of sexual reproduction of the union of gametes. Keep in mind that the human egg was only discovered at the end of the 1800s, in the 1880s, by a German fellow, von Bayer, okay? And he's the one who actually discovered the human egg for the first time in the late 1800s. And so back in the Middle Ages, there was really no concept of fertilization of gametes coming together and so forth. It was based on very simple and crude observations. And what were the observations? The observations were that men produced semen and that women bled periodically. And so what was considered was that the woman was like the ground, and they made analogies from agriculture, that the seed is planted in the ground, and then that seed would grow from the ground into a new organism. In the case of agriculture, a plant. In the case of humans, the seed, and that's where semen comes from, the root of semen is from seed, that white liquid is deposited into the woman who is just fertile ground, and that white liquid starts to congeal and to solidify into a tiny little human being, which used to be called homunculus, the tiny little human, all right? And when the proof of that is that the blood of the mother was the nourishment of that little homunculus. All right, so the menstrual period was considered that that blood was wasted because there was no fertilization. But people just from simple observation noticed that women who were pregnant were not bleeding, and so that blood was being used to nourish the little homunculus into a baby that would eventually be born. And so basically, from that perspective, the baby came from the father, from the semen of the father, and what the mother contributed was just nourishment, like the ground, like the earth and Mother Earth and all these analogies, okay? Frankly and honestly and in all humility, it was a totally defective biology that they had in the Middle Ages, including Thomas Aquinas, who was the great systematizer of the church, to the point that Aquinas believed in the late hominization, in the late ensoulment. And he went even further into that error, unfortunately, because of the lack of biological understanding. He said that the late hominization happened differently for men and for women, all right? And he said that for men, it was 40 days. After fertilization, within 40 days of the pregnancy, was that God granted the soul to the man, to the boy, all right? And to the woman, it was granted 80 days after. So it would take twice as much. In other words, his idea was that it took twice as much for the woman baby to form as the man. Why? Because women were inferior. It was a standard of the time. Inferior in the sense that they were weaker, smaller in the body, perhaps not as intellectually up to par with men, because fewer women actually got any studies or any education done back then, all right? And they were relegated to the house keeping chores. So that was a very defective biology, a very defective anthropology, all right? But it was based just on the simplistic exterior evidence, in fact, even quickening, which traditionally is when the mother feels the baby for the first time, which is going to be around that first trimester between 40 and 80 days, whatever. It's a very subjective, and it's a moving target. That was all the evidence that they had at the time for sustaining the late hominization or the late ensoulment. That idea has kind of stuck through for so many centuries, but today with what we know about fertilization and the fusion of gametes and the 50% from each parent and so forth, truly we have to go to immediate fertilization, immediate ensoulment. In other words, it is logical. Of course, we're entering the realm of faith here because we cannot pretend to know exactly when God grants a soul to any human being, all right? Because it's an act of creation. However, it is logical to assume that God would grant a soul to the zygote, an individual, simple, eternal soul, in the characteristic of humans, because anytime after the zygote, as I have been showing with the films and all this, it's arbitrary, okay? Also, we can assume, I mean, it is safe. When we speak about God, we're really entering the realm of mystery, and we move away from science because it's not empirical. I cannot give you any proof or even mathematical proof of what I'm talking about in theology, but it's going to be reasonable. It stands to reason, to logic. For example, it is unreasonable to think that God is unreasonable, okay? And so it stands to reason that God would want, if God is love, God would want every human being to be saved, to be redeemed. And say we have a zygote that doesn't have a soul yet, that will receive a soul sometime after the zygote, maybe at the morula, maybe at the blastocyst, maybe gastrula, maybe at the fetal level, wherever you put it. That would mean that that little embryo, human, genetically human, all right, is a human species, a Homo sapiens, without a soul for a particular time in his or her life. What if that little embryo dies before the soul is granted? That little embryo has no possibility of redemption, has no possibility of eternal life. It is literally soulless human being. Can you think of anything more cruel than for God to leave a human being without a soul? Literally soulless. Our logic tells us that that is a cruel thing to do. And one thing that God cannot be, if God is love, is to be cruel, right? And so it stands to reason. It is, we use an argument of reason. That's why theology is grounded on philosophy. And we're going to move a little bit more into that, unless people have some question or comment about these two theories that went on for centuries. John.
So, what happens to the soul of living things do? What's the theory of animals and soul?
Yes, because they are individual substances, but they're not of a rational nature, okay? And therefore, their soul is not eternal. And in fact, Aquinas posited 3 types of souls. Actually 4 if you consider the angels, but 3 here on earth. The human soul, the animal soul, and the vegetable soul. And in fact, soul in Latin is anima, or animus, and that's where we get animation. In other words, because the thing is living, this thing has some kind of anima, all right? And there's the vegetable soul, the animal soul, and then the human soul. But the other 2 are not eternal, okay?
Silver, they mentioned that we are Judeo-Christians, and part of the Jewish tradition was how they looked at blood.
Yes.
Which we talk passing of the ovaries.
Yes.
For instance, they saw blood as life as well as death.
Yes.
And so the ritual was that the woman had to go through a cleansing before
right.
they could.
Okay, the ritual impurity of menstruation.
Right. So I can understand that part, but you mentioned about Aquinas. I know the statement he made concerning the soul. 40 days for the man, 80 days for the woman.
Yes.
Could this come from because remember he was a
one book man.
Aristotle.
Yes.
And of course Aristotle.
Well, later when they were translated. Yes. Right.
Well, the teaching of Plato said that the soul would fall from grace, would fall to the man's body. And if the man didn't live a good life, right, that when the man passes away, the soul will go to the woman's body. So could that have been his train of thought when he saw the woman being ensouled after the man?
Yes. Okay. Frankly, I don't know. I don't know the details of why he thought that way. Okay. But remember that Aquinas discovered Aristotle only through the translations that Avicenna did of those, because Aquinas, as smart as he was, he did not know Greek, all right? And so this Muslim Avicenna translated Aristotle into Latin, and then he discovered it, and he found the philosophical grounding for his theology. But rather, Aquinas' thought was based mostly on the Bible, because he was also known as a one-book man. It is said that he carried the Bible on his arm all the time. okay?
Yeah.
And he knew the Bible, so he was basing his all his theology on biblical passages. And we know that 40 is a time of journey, and that 40 is very symbolic for the Jewish people, okay? And 40 was also the time that Jesus spent in the desert before beginning his public ministry and so forth. So he was looking at symbolic passages. Also, with regards to the quickening, could be interpreted at the visitation of Mary pregnant to Elizabeth pregnant, and Elizabeth says to Mary, the moment your greeting was heard in my ears, the baby in my womb stirred for joy. So there is that double visitation, right, of embryonic John, who recognizes embryonic Jesus as the Messiah and leaps for joy. That could also be interpreted as the moment of quickening where Elizabeth felt the baby in her womb. So Aquinas was using the scriptures to ground his biology. But this essentially are pre-scientific times up until the 16th century or the 15th century with the Copernican revolution in Europe. Really, before then, it was essentially pre-scientific times in that there was no rigor of the scientific method or anything like that. Okay. All right, so today, with the biological information that we have overwhelmingly of sexual reproduction, it stands to reason that ensoulment, if one is believing in ensoulment, ensoulment would have to happen at fertilization, at syngamy. Now, we also have, through our Judeo-Christian tradition, the belief in body and soul one as a unit. We're not dualistic in looking at the soul as, for example, a water that is poured into a glass and you have distinct the water and the glass. No, we consider that we are body and soul one in a substantial unit, and Pope John Paul spoke a lot about that, meaning that there is an integration between our body and our soul. Otherwise, we would fall into a dualism, which could lead into reincarnation, for example. When we die, our soul goes, when our body dies, our soul goes into another living creature and so forth. But then we lose the individuality and the personality of our soul, the distinct personality. So this principle of unity, body and soul, a substantial unit, is very important. From that perspective, then death becomes a mystery, because it is a separation between body and soul, but it is a temporary mystery, in that at the second coming of our Lord, as we say in the creed, the bottom part of the creed, the last part of the creed, the resurrection of the dead and life everlasting. So that we believe that somehow mysteriously God will reunite every soul with every body here on earth at the end of time, back to that substantial unit in what we call a glorified body, which is no longer subject to illness or death again and so forth. So that substantial unit is restored. So death does present a mystery to us and a challenge, if you will, to the substantial unity of body and soul, but we believe that it is a temporary separation. Okay, I'm just giving you a little bit of philosophy and theology there, crunched in to the punchline of the substantial unit between the body and the soul. Granted, we assume that God would grant that at the moment of fertilization at syngamy. If that zygote, if the finality of that zygote, if the teleology, I should put this word teleology, let me put it here. Our ultimate end, our finality, is to be in with God, which is what Aquinas called the beatific vision. In other words, in the contemplation of the Blessed Trinity for all eternity, face to face. Okay? So this teleology will begin with the zygote. As soon as that zygote receives from God that soul, that human, individual, eternal soul, is oriented toward eternity if that zygote was meant to be a human being to begin with. All right? Put that on a bracket for a moment, and I'll come back to it because of these two challenges. If that is so, then how do we account for monozygotic twinning? And even more strangely, how do we account for twin reabsorption and still maintain the unity and the indivisibility of the human soul, the personal individuality of the human soul? Okay, this is what I'm talking about. Folks, people still with me? If you have questions or comments, jump in. If I can't hear you, call me or something. All right? There we go. All right, so twinning. We're going to get a little bit into twinning from the biological perspective. There are typically three categories of twinning, actually two, and the second one splits up. We have dizygotic twinning and monozygotic twinning, and then the special case of conjoined twins. Let's look at dizygotic and monozygotic twinning. Dizygotic, from the prefix di, di means two zygotes, all right? They're also known as fraternal twins. Two zygotes from the beginning, from fertilization, means that there were two eggs present. In other words, every now and then, a woman ovulates two eggs simultaneously instead of just one. Okay, it can be on either side of the tube, or it can be from the same ovary or from opposite ovaries. That whole reproductive tract, if intercourse has happened with a competent man with competent sperm, all that tract is going to be full of sperm. So whatever eggs are around are going to get fertilized. 2, 3, 4, any number. All right, and that's how we get twins or triplets or quadruplets. Sometimes I think the record is about 8 or 9 octuplets. You've heard of 8 twins, right? Some have actually survived. Of course, they're all very tiny, but they could be normal human beings. Anyway, any number of mature eggs that are around are likely, on average, to be fertilized because, again, there are millions of sperm around, right? So any egg will be fertilized, which will go into a zygote, morula, blastocyst. The blastocyst will implant different parts, hopefully, different parts of the placenta, of the uterus, and these two can develop into normal pregnancy. They will be twins. They call fraternal twins, and they can be boy-girl because they come from two different sperms, right? No problem with those because God can grant a soul here, can grant a soul there, and move forward with normal embryonic development for each one of the twins. How about monozygotic twins? Monozygotic twins is from a single egg fertilized by a single sperm, which then splits within the first 2 weeks of embryonic development all the way up to the gastrula stage. You can have an early split at the level of the morula into 2 blastocysts who will then implant and develop 2 embryos with 2 placentas and so forth, and 2 embryonic sacs also because the split was early on. Or the split can happen a little later after the morula in the blastocyst stage. The blastocyst stage, actually the ICM, remember the ICM, inner cell mass, which becomes the embryo proper. That ICM sometimes duplicates, splits in half, all right? And because each ICM is totipotent, then that ICM is going to develop into a little tiny embryo who will have separate embryonic sacs, but they will share a common placenta because they share a common trophoblast. And it is the trophoblast that becomes the placenta, right? Okay, so that's when it happens at the blastocyst stage, that the split happens at the blastocyst stage, essentially the ICM. Even further along, already into implantation at the gastrula stage, still within the first 2 weeks of pregnancy, that little gastrula can actually split into 2, all right, and form 2 little embryos, develop into 2 little embryos who will then have not only a common placenta because they come from a common trophoblast, but because they really come from a common ICM, which split later at the three, when the three germ layers were being formed, all right, they will also have a common amniotic sac, okay? But the point is that all these three cases can happen. They're called monozygotic twins because they come from a monozygote. They come from a single zygote, from a single egg that was fertilized. And these are what we know as identical twins. I think I showed you some identical twins in last course. And they are living, they have a soul. And so how can we posit here then two souls? Because we're saying if God is granting a soul at fertilization, excuse me, that's the zygote here, right? Okay, follow this possible argument. These are possible, these are plausible, these are reasonable arguments for starting with one soul and ending up with two babies with two souls, one individual soul each. Okay, follow the logic. So take any one of the cases. We start with one zygote, one soul. At the moment of split, okay, let's start with this first one. At the moment of split, what has happened here? This is a morula, right? This is a two-cell stage. What has happened? What is the biological process that has happened from here to here? Mitosis, right? Mitosis, cell division. This is cell division. This is a diploid cell. The zygote is a diploid cell. The morula, the blastomeres of the morula are diploid cells. So mitosis has happened here, first cleavage. At this point, at this very early stage, these two blastomeres separate radically. Each one, essentially, because that cell is totipotent, the blastomere is totipotent, that cell essentially reverts to being a zygote and will continue his or her embryonic development into a blastocyst and into gastrula, implanting, and so on and so forth. And the twin will do the same. What about the soul? Okay, if we consider this as a type of asexual reproduction, in other words, by mitosis, by cloning, by splitting, all right, one of the two twins, so here we have two twins, one of the twins remains with the original soul. The other twin, as soon as the new twin is generated, what prevents God from granting that new twin a soul? Is there anything that would prevent God from granting that new twin a soul as soon as that new twin becomes a new individual? Nothing is preventing that. And therefore, what I'm saying is that from one individual and one soul through a very special type of asexual reproduction, we get two individuals early on with two souls. What we will never know is which one of these two twins had the original soul and which one had the later soul. We will never know, but who cares? God knows, and that's what's important.
Well, isn't every soul original?
Yes.
In one sense.
Exactly. That's the whole point. Every soul, every human soul is original, individual, personal, and eternal, and simple. And so therefore, as soon as what I'm positing is that as soon as these two cells, these two blastomeres separate radically and have the capacity to become a new individual, each one, at that point, God will grant the soul to whichever is coming from the other. And so the generator will remain with the original soul and the generatee will receive a soul from God. Okay?
Maybe it's safe to say maybe it's the granting of the soul that causes it to split.
Well, they would be simultaneous. They will be simultaneous. This is why teleology is important. Why teleology? Because who knows our ultimate end? We don't know our ultimate end, but God does. None of us can really have certainty that we're going to end up in heaven or hell. Purgatory being that partial stage, okay, that temporary stage. None of us know, but God knows. Even before he created us. In the mind of God, everything that is and that will be has already been in a single act because God is simple and therefore everything has already occurred in the mind of God. And therefore he knew from all eternity when these souls, when these two are going to split in every single human being that exists on earth. Talk about magnificent. But if he is almighty, if he is omnipotent, that's what it means. And he's omniscient, he knows everything, he's capable of everything, all right? Omnipotent, omniscient are the characteristics of God that we intuit about God. If God is God, then he's got to be the maximum, okay? So it's a theory. It's there's logic to it. It doesn't contradict the biology. There's no magic. There's no pulling rabbits out of a hat. There's no trickery. Simply, when these two blastomeres separate radically and have the realistic, the existential capacity to become two human beings, God grants a soul to the one that doesn't have a soul yet. All right? Simultaneously. And if it happens later, then later. And even further later. In other words, as soon as that second individual is individuated, becomes an individual, God is free to grant a soul to that individual. In the human, it happens biologically that this window is within the first 2 weeks of embryonic development. That has been confirmed, let's say, experimentally or empirically. All right? So that's what we have. Therefore, monozygotic twins present a challenge until we follow through with the biology and the theology to see that it's possible from one individual human being to come up with two individual human beings. And this is, I'm proposing that this is a very special type of asexual reproduction that we have early on, which is reminiscent of the other sexual reproductions in lower beings, you know, when the starfish fragments and regenerates and so forth. Because why? At the end of the day, we're talking about essentially stem cells. We're talking about cell potential. These cells are called totipotent. The zygote is totipotent, the more or less pluripotent. All right? And that's what it means. Biologically, totipotent means the capacity to generate a new human being. John?
Are the chances for twins, is that a hereditary?
It seems to be hereditary. There are a lot of studies being done in there. I'm not too familiar with the stats. The one stat that I had seen was that these monozygotic twins, I think, was 1 in 64 births or something like that. That's when I was doing my research in the 90s, for my first doctorate. But yeah, there's a lot of research being done on twins, because especially the monozygotic twins, because they have essentially identical DNA. You know.
Is it cyclins or some kind of protein that causes the split?
So, of course, there's a very complex biochemical machinery that is guiding all this, but it's there, okay? And it's there, and we can say that potentially it's quiescent in every single zygote, and in some zygotes, very few zygotes, for some kind of rare stimulus, it triggers on. You know, just like we have these proto-oncogenes and so forth, that they're quiescent, they're silent in our genome, but if some stimulus triggers it, they're going to express, okay? So we have really in our DNA, you know, in those 3 billion base pairs, we have a tremendous amount of information that is quiescent, that is silent. And whatever stimulates it, if the proper target hits, boom, it will express. So who knows, it's very interesting to find out the rare mechanism of what produces homozygotic twinning. But it's got to be there because it's a physiological phenomenon. That it's empirical, it's observable. Okay, so you see that this monozygotic twinning can represent a challenge at first, but when we look at the biology in detail, it can be consistent with a teleology, with a theology of God granting a soul as soon as the new individual individuates, becomes that individual. More challenging are twin reabsorption, conjoined, thank you. So these are conjoined twins. These are the Mata girls, and these are the Hensel ladies, all right? You're gonna see some strong pictures now, photographs and diagrams, but this is again a reality because these are photographs. In other words, these people really exist. These were the Mata, Hope and Faith Mata, when they were conjoined and they were born like this. Two bodies that are joined at the center. Providentially, they had their own vital organs, and they were sharing some of their structures and certainly a lot of skin and so forth. But the main vital organs, the vital organs, were duplicated. Each little twin had their own vital organs, okay? And so they were able to be separated surgically, and that's a success right there, okay? In contrast, Abby and Brittany are obviously two individual human beings that are sharing a common body. This is drastic, it is dramatic. But there they are in their 20s, alive. In fact, I saw somewhere that they had, for some time, they have a TV series. They had a series for some time here in the US. I think it was back in the 90s, I'm not sure. But they are two individuals that they share a common body, all right? So they obviously have to do everything together. But we can consider this essentially the body from the neck down. The body can be seen as a support system for the head, and more specifically for the brain. You notice that we have actually all 5 senses on the head, right? And so the body from the neck down can be seen as an organic biological support system for the head. But really, it's in the brain that thought resides and will resides. And we can say that essentially the soul can also most likely reside in the brain, because we can think of a person that has no arms, no legs, and we can think of a person who could have artificial lung and artificial heart and artificial kidneys and so on and so forth, but the brain is being maintained alive. So these are drastic examples. They're real. They're called conjoined twins. They can be conjoined at several different parts of the body. In fact, this has been studied on diagram, and this is essentially the diagram. They can be subdivided into 2 types, either dorsal or ventral twinning, dorsal conjoined twinning or ventral conjoined twinning, depending on where they're joined and how drastically they're joined or how little they're joined. All right, these are almost 2 separate. This is practically, the 2 faces are actually fused. All right, so here's a diagram of the different types of cojoining that can happen. This is showing, so this is the central disc of the early gastrula, and it is showing the central disc, how it's splitting, how there are 2 central discs and how they're fused in different geometries, what the result will be. So you can see that this is all being studied. Some are very drastic and dramatic. Some can be separated. Many of them don't survive, of course, the embryonic stage or the fetal development. Many of them die. Sometimes one twin dies and the other one doesn't die. And then what can happen is that the other twin can be reabsorbed by the tissue of the growing twin. It's called twin reabsorption or resorption for short. It's also known as vanishing twin. Here is a sonogram, maybe similar to what you experienced, Andrea, that you shared at the beginning of class. Here is obviously a well-formed fetus, and the expert is identifying this as a vanishing twin here. And as these days and weeks develop and months, this tissue will vanish some more and will be reabsorbed by the other tissue, sometimes into the placenta, but sometimes into the body of the other twin. So this other twin is being reabsorbed into the living twin, okay? Resorption, very drastic. Strong photographs, but these are actual photographs, okay? Very drastic. This lady is obviously alive and had a reabsorbed twin on her back that is totally degenerate, and there is no live human being here separate from the lady who is carrying this mass of tissue, all right? This one even more drastic because these twins joined at the head, and this twin managed to develop a face. Typically, this obviously is not alive, and the brain is most likely hydrocephalic from the size. It's enlarged and probably full of fluid, non-functional, and not as a living individual. This whole head here is obviously being fed by this baby, and when you look at this baby from his or her forehead down, he or she looks pretty normal, right?
Were they separated in that case?
I don't know the follow-up on this. I didn't have time to do the research, but I found that I wanted to show you because it's an actual photograph, and it's pretty obvious to the eye that from her forehead down, this baby looks quite normal. But this one is totally abnormal, non-living, non-viable, non-functional, and my suspicion is that they would try to separate this at some point for sure, okay? It all depends how much of this brain may actually be shared or not, or the vascularity, in other words, how established are these veins and arteries here. But this would take some very tricky surgery and some very, very delicate surgery. Some of these surgeries go on for days and they change. So the protocol is established beforehand, and they'll end up a whole team of surgeons, and maybe sometimes there are 2 and 3 teams of surgeons that come in on a rotating basis. After a few hours, they bring a second team and keep going and keep going. The actual surgery may last 2, 3, or 4 days, and with different teams of experts coming in and all kinds of support system. But it can happen. We're getting very sophisticated with technology. So this is a drastic case. How do we deal with this? With the global problem of this reabsorption or vanishing twin. Well, what we have is a special case of monozygotic twin that has gone even a step further. Potentially, hypothetically, we can go back here and consider we had no problem in considering that these 2 human beings can have an individual soul, all right? Make the argument for that. But then at some point, one of these twins dies and the other one starts reabsorbing that twin. What happens then? Do we revert to one soul back? Can one soul absorb another soul? No. Essentially what we have is the death of one individual. When an individual dies, that soul goes either into heaven or to hell. We assume there's no personal sin here. There is original sin according to our theology, but so maybe that soul would spend some time in purgatory, but essentially we have the death of an individual. We have the death of an individual, the release, if you will, of that soul into his or her eternity, whatever was in the mind of God, and the other twin continues to live with his or her soul until he or she is born. So what is absorbed or reabsorbed is the tissue, is the carcass, if you will, what is left of the remains of that embryo, of the dead embryo. If the embryo was meant to be a human being to begin with, because you can see from these diagrams, this was not meant to be a human being to begin with, okay? The yolk sac that you spoke about, maybe there was no little embryo, so maybe it was a trophoblast only that developed. Okay? And so there was no teleology of a second human being there. So what is being reabsorbed is really just tissue. In that case, there was only one soul from the beginning, all right, which is on the living. We assume that this lady has a soul, she looks human, and this baby also looks human, has a soul. Okay? And if this baby was alive at some point and was in the teleology of God to be a human being, this obviously is non-viable. So we can assume that this baby died at some point and that soul went to the destiny that God had for that soul. All right? And then it's up to medicine whether they can do anything about this or not. Some conjoined twins have to stay joined simply because the sharing of structures is too deep to be separated today. So let me kind of round this up for a moment. We hold that ensoulment will happen at fertilization, at syngamy, at the moment of the zygote, and that the two challenges that are presented in biology are resolvable by considering that monozygotic twins will split into two souls, into two human beings undergoing a special type of asexual reproduction. And the resorption case, the one soul undergoes the split originally analogous to monozygotic twins into two souls. If resorption is occurring, it means that one of those two human beings died. That soul was released to its eternity, to its destiny, and the other soul continues to live on. As long as we hold that there is no minimal time that is required for a human being to live in order to be considered a human being. In other words, it's all about the finality of the zygote. If that zygote was intended to be a human being, had the genetic capacity to be a human being, and was willed in the mind of God to be a human being, we assume that that zygote received the soul. Later on, if that zygote was meant to split into two human beings, then the new soul is posited at that time. If even further along, one of those human beings was meant to die early on and be reabsorbed, it still should be reabsorbed by its sibling, so be it. That soul is released and the story continues in a logical consistency. All right? It requires some thinking, some insight, and some reflection, but it's explainable. It has a logical consistency. Mm-hmm. As long as we hold that there's no really minimal time for existence, physically, physiological, to qualify as human being. Could be a minute, an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, a decade, or a century, right? Questions, comments?
Just going back to the different types of monozygotic twins, do they all have their own placenta? There's a question I had from before.
It depends where the split happened. Let's go back there for a moment.
And the yolk sac is to feed early on in development.
Yes, but the yolk sac already, the embryo has already established, okay, because the 3 germ layers are formed, right, and then the yolk sac is being reabsorbed.
And it's using the nutrients from the yolk.
Yes, that's correct.
Early on.
Okay, yes. So here we have the 3 possible cases. If the split, it depends how early the split happened. If the split happened at the morla stage, then you will have 2 separate blastocysts, right, who will implant, and because the blastocyst has the ICM, which we call the embryo, and the trophoblast becomes a placenta. So you get 2 embryos with each one with their own individual placenta and also their own embryonic sac, okay, because the embryonic sac also comes from the other part of the trophoblast. Whereas if the split happens in the blastocyst stage with 2 ICMs, they are going to share a common placenta because they have a common trophoblast. But because they're 2 ICMs, they will develop 2 embryonic sacs. If it happens even later at the gastrula stage, you really have, at implantation, you have still a single blastocyst implanting with a trophoblast and ICM intact. And it's later, after implantation, in the gastrula stage, that the split happens. And that split is only of the 2 embryos, which means that they will share a placenta and they will always share an embryonic sac. So it really depends on when the split happens, before or after implantation, okay? And these are all biological things that have happened empirically, so we have to address them theologically to have a theory that is global enough that can include these cases. Okay, folks? That was actually part of the dissertation project, so I've given you the crunch down summary in a few hours of what took about 2 years to develop, all right? All right. So what we're saying then is fertilization happened. This is normal development. This is normal fertilization and embryonic development for the human. fertilization happening at the ampulla, then that mitotic division, early embryonic development in the first week, implantation, from zygote through morula, blastocyst, and then the gastrula and all the other development that occurs there. Eventually at 8 weeks, changing from embryo to fetus when all the organ systems are in place but tiny, until further growth to the 9-month development, right? So just emphasizing that normal development where all these things can happen along the way. I think it's a good moment to break for a little bit, and then when we come back, we're going to go now into 2 heavy social topics, abortion and in vitro. So if there are no other questions or comments, also from the rest of the group, then we're going to go into the break. Okay, I'm going to pause this for a moment. Okay, folks, welcome back. And we're going to continue into the second and third half of this, second, third, and third of this lecture. Now we're going to look at 2 practical issues that have big social impact, as we know, for decades now, which is abortion and in vitro fertilization. Okay? Just to recap then, we can hold that in normal human fertilization, ensoulment, the gift of a soul, will happen at syngamy, where then will be normal embryonic development. And even if there is some monozygotic twin, we can explain the possibility of 2 individuals with their own soul. And even with twin reabsorption, we can also consider the soul maintaining, and that individual maintaining his or her soul, his or her individuality to birth and beyond. Therefore, if life begins at conception, that has human life, human person, anthropologically speaking, existentially speaking, that has big implications for the legalization of abortion and all the other manipulation that is going on with human embryos today. So we're going to get into this topic. You can follow along in the little outline that I gave you. As far as abortion is concerned, there are 2 types of abortion, medically speaking. There is what is called spontaneous abortion or miscarriage, and there is procured or elective or induced abortions. Okay? Spontaneous abortions happen normally, like the word says, in the body when the human body, when the female reproductive tract discards a little embryo. Early on in the pregnancy, typically happens within the first 2 weeks of pregnancy. And in the vast majority of those early abortions, those spontaneous abortions that have been examined clinically, that little embryo has some kind of defect, some kind of genetic defect. So we can see spontaneous abortion as a type of natural selection, a natural quality control. In other words, the little embryo had some kind of genetic defect, and therefore he or she was discarded, did not implant well, or even after implanted, did not establish the placenta like they should do, and they were discarded naturally by a process of natural selection. There's obviously no guilt, no fault, no desire to kill a human being there on the part of the mother, unless, of course, she was totally reckless about her pregnancy maybe or something like that. But normally, spontaneous abortion don't carry any wrongdoing with them because they occur naturally. And also, they typically occur within the first couple of weeks of pregnancy. And many times what happens is that the woman doesn't even know she's pregnant. She actually thinks that she missed her period or she's having a late period, and she's actually having a loss, an early pregnancy loss. Okay? They're that tiny. When that loss happens later in the pregnancy, it's called a miscarriage. And it can be a little embryo or a fetus, but it happens later, and that's why the name changes to miscarriage. There's more of a conscience that there was actually a little human being there. And we're talking basically the death, the demise of an embryo or a fetus. And again, the vast majority of these that have been examined clinically, they have some kind of deformity. Different is what is known as either a procured abortion or an elective abortion or an induced abortion. These all really mean the same bioethically. Ethically, they have the same value. It's just that different groups of people use different language. For example, in theology, in ecclesiastical terms, in religious terms, we tend to talk about a procured abortion. In other words, the woman goes to procure an abortion by her own will. Sometimes forced, sometimes pressure or coerced, but there's the will to do that. In other words, it is procured by the woman. Then typically society wants to take away any kind of stigma, and so it is a woman's choice, it is a woman's election, and so society in general will talk about an elective abortion. The woman has elected, has chosen to have an abortion, all right, trying to take away the ethical value of it. In the medical setting, in the clinical setting, you will find an induced abortion, which could be medically indicated. Of course, you understand that today, since the passage of Roe versus Wade in 1973, then abortion is legal in the United States up until the 9th month, okay? Up until the 9th month, abortion is legal. Now, of course, from the second trimester forward, the woman needs to have some kind of a medical reason for her abortion. And she needs to have the consent or the approval of a judge. There are plenty of judges in every state of the union that are pro-choice and liberal and will sign that release to the woman just upon request, without even seeing any kind of a medical or a clinical indication for it, just because the woman wants it. In other words, that's the psychological health, that's the psychological reason for the woman, okay? So I want to establish and be clear that abortion in the United States today, as in many countries of the world, is legal up until the 9th month of pregnancy. Early on, for whatever reason, the woman doesn't need a reason to have an abortion. Later in the pregnancy, from the 2nd trimester on, she needs some kind of a medical indication, but the medical indication can also be a psychological indication that the pregnancy is causing her distress. That is something that qualifies as a mental distress, and therefore the doctor will sign off on it, and the judge will also sign off on it. So existentially, practically, there are no barriers for the woman other than her own psychology and her own becoming aware more and more that she's actually carrying a human being inside. Okay? All right, and induced is for medical indication. Some doctors are saying that there are some medical conditions that really threaten the life of the mother seriously and therefore could warrant an abortion. And the classical one is hypertension and the fact that the baby's growth and so fast growth is endangering the physical life of the mother because of taxing her heart and her circulatory system and her pressure, okay, her blood pressure. And so she can die or she can go into a stroke or heart attack. We are sustaining in the pro-life camp that when we look at those clinical cases that are drastic, they can be managed clinically, they can be managed medically for the mother, so that the risk can be minimized, at least until the point of viability. What happens at viability? Viability means that the fetus can now survive outside of the mother's womb in an artificial setting, which is called essentially a neonatal IC unit. they're almost artificial wombs, okay? I think the earliest survival now is 23, 24 weeks of embryonic development. It's just amazing how these little tiny fetuses can already be saved in a NICU unit is NICU, neonatal ICU, intensive care unit. And therefore, if the fetus has reached viability, do a C-section, take the fetus out, and that hypertension is going to diminish, right? So we're sustaining that these doctors that are claiming a clinical medical indication to induce an abortion really have no medical basis for it. In other words, there's medical management for that pregnancy so that both the mother and the child can be saved. At any rate, let's look at some of the terminology and then the methods, and finally, alternatives. I also want to mention in passing that there are other, aside from what is straightforward an abortion, in other words, going into mother's womb with either chemicals or mechanical structures to evacuate that womb, to evacuate that embryo or fetus, there are other items that also cause abortion, even if they're not intended. They're intended typically for contraception, but they can also cause abortion. These are called abortifacients that they can cause an abortion. The intrauterine device, the copper T, as it's known also, is inserted into the uterus. And these two ends, what they do, essentially, they stimulate the uterus into thinking that it's pregnant, okay? And so that starts a whole chain of hormonal reactions that will essentially suppress ovulation, because the uterus is being fooled into thinking that it's pregnant. And so that's why I say, really, nature is a very mechanical thing. Nature does not forgive. If you get the proper stimulus, you are going to get the proper response. Or improper stimulus, improper response. All right? And so that's what the IUD does. Today, the IUD has been perfected, whereby the tip also has estrogen or some other hormone. So it's both a mechanical and a chemical contraceptive.
A quick question. If that turns the body into thinking that it's pregnant, then how it can provoke an abortion?
Exactly.
How can that happen?
Exactly. So what happens in this case is what is known as breakthrough ovulation. Breakthrough ovulation also happens with the pill that is given for the purpose of suppressing ovulation, right? It's a contraceptive pill. Actually, what they do is they play with the hormones, and it's a low dosage of the hormone of estrogen that suppresses ovulation. But then what happens? The body is the body, and these things are artificial. A copper T is artificial, the pill is artificial, and the body is supremely elegant in its nature. And there's a hard-wiring nature for women, once they reach menarche, to ovulate on average every 28 days for about 30 years, all right? That's kind of hardwired in there. And so even with the estrogen present with the pill or with the copper T or both combinations, because some women have a T and also are taking contraceptives, all right, because they absolutely don't want to get pregnant. Well, even with all those mechanisms, chemical and mechanical, sometimes we get what is known as breakthrough ovulation. In other words, the ovaries still produce, the follicles still mature, and there is a ruptured follicle and there is a mature egg that is produced in spite of all the signaling that it's getting. It overrides those signaling. Again, it's called breakthrough ovulation, and it happens occasionally. For example, they will tell you that the pill is 99% effective, all right? Which is actually, I think it's about 98% or 99%, it depends. Let's say that it's 99.9%. Okay, let's start with 99. Let's keep the math simple for now. 99% effective, that's pretty good. That's fantastic, right? What does that mean really statistically? 99% effective, it means that on average, out of 100 women who are taking the pill religiously, as we say, in other words, every day, every cycle, every year. They're just at the same time, every day, you know, they're just 100% committed to taking the pill, the contraceptive pill, because the pill is 99% effective. It means that on average, out of every 100 women who are on the pill, 1 will get pregnant, because that's the 99 percentile, you know? That's the 99. In other words, 1 will get pregnant taking the pill on average. Now you multiply this times the 150 million women who are in the US, that 1% becomes very significant, okay? So let's say it's 99.9% effective. Move the decimal period over, okay? It means that 1 in 1,000 will get pregnant. 1 in 10,000 will be 99.99% effective, which doesn't have, the pill doesn't have, maybe just 1 decimal at most, okay? So it means that out of every 1,000 women who are on the pill, 1 will get pregnant. That's the statistic on average, you know? So that's called breakthrough ovulation, because the body is kind of hardwired to do that, okay? And it's a very, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the chemistry of the body is very complex, is very sophisticated, is very elegant, and it's kind of pretentious for us to think that just by fooling around with the hormones, we're going to get the body to do what we want it to do 100% of the time. It's not going to happen, okay? Okay, so that's called breakthrough ovulation, which means that if you have an egg and they're having intercourse because they think they're safe, she's going to get pregnant. And now we have an unwanted pregnancy. And then what happens, that little embryo is going to start developing and doing his or her thing toward implantation. But when he or she reaches the uterus, guess what? She finds that the uterus is hostile because the uterus is already thinking that it has a pregnancy, and so it rejects that implantation, doesn't implant. And so that little embryo is discarded. And that's the early abortion. And that's the abortifacient effect of the copper T of the IUD. Is that if there is breakthrough ovulation, and if there is pregnancy, and if that embryo seeks to implant and doesn't implant, then he or she is discarded, and that is a procured abortion because there is nothing natural about what happened there. You know, what prevented the implantation, okay? The same can happen with the pill, and the same can happen with also the morning after pill, also known as Plan B, which is sometimes it's a single pill, sometimes it's 2 pills, but this is even after the intercourse, the morning after, assumingly that the intercourse happened the night before. And the idea is that even as the embryo is being, that the main effect of this pill is to prevent fertilization, just trying to cash in on the fact that fertilization doesn't happen right away. They can happen within the 5 days window, okay? That's what Plan B is trying to hedge its bets, is that the sperm have not actually reached the egg, or that the woman was not actually ovulating yet, and it's trying to prevent the actual fertilization. But if this Plan B does not do its trick in preventing the fertilization, what it's going to do is going to cause a hostile environment in the uterus, and therefore it's going to prevent implantation, and therefore have an abortifacient effect. And we get this, why? Because again, Plan B, levonorgestrel, which is the hormone that is used, is 99.9% effective. So that 0.1% ineffectiveness is saying that there is some breakthrough ovulation that is happening, and it's not implanting, and therefore a very early induced abortion. Okay, I'm just mentioning this a little bit as a side, but this is where this abortifacient factor comes in as a side effect of these contraceptive devices. Move a little further. We'll look at some terminology. This is from a clinical book. Actually, this is from Moore's Embryology, the standard text for human embryology in medical schools. I've listed the names here just sequentially. A threatened abortion is when a woman is at high risk of having an abortion. It could be, sometimes it's hereditary. Girls, daughters of women who have difficulty holding pregnancies may also themselves have difficulty, holding the pregnancy, so it's called a threatening abortion. She could be bleeding, she could lose the pregnancy. Spontaneous abortion I spoke about. Habitual abortion is when a woman is unable to sustain a pregnancy. Typically the fetus is non-viable, and so she continues to have a spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. Is very sad and tragic for women who are trying to get pregnant, and they continue to lose a child time and again. It's called habitual abortion. Induced, I spoke about when there is seemingly some kind of a medical indication for it. Incomplete, now this is with the procedure of abortion. They did not take out all the body parts of the fetus, all right? They have left some parts of the body inside the mother. That is extremely dangerous because those parts are now becoming necrotic, and then they can become infected and infect the mother. It's a very serious situation, and it's called an incomplete abortion. Oh, I'm sorry, complete is when all the body parts are out, actually. This is very tragic. This is so gruesome. The nurse that is assisting the doctor actually has to reassemble the fetus part by part to make sure that all the parts were taken out of the body of the mother. Okay. It is not declared a complete abortion until all those body parts are reassembled. Many nurses have quit their profession after doing one of those. Miscarriage, I spoke about, is just a spontaneous abortion later on when the fetus is actually a little more developed. But this is just some standard terminology that is in medical books. It's important that you be familiar with it. In the United States, we know that since 1973, that decision of the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade, 60 million abortions estimated in the United States, okay? 60 million only in the United States. What are all the wars, victims of wars, of all the wars in the history of the world? In the world, it's about 400 or 500 million. It's just staggering. I mentioned this also, these other contraceptives, which can act as abortifacients. I want to just go briefly over some of the different methods that are used. Again, as bioethicists, it's important that you know the clinical part of it so that you know the terminology and can enter into the dialogue. Depending on the methods, some are medical, some are chemical, and some are mechanical, and most are a combination of both. So when chemicals are used for the abortion, typically it's early on, and the fetus is passed intact, or the embryo, they're called medical abortions. So when chemicals are used, it's called a medical abortion. Whereas when mechanical instruments, essentially dilating the cervix, going in there with it's like a scalpel that will cut up the fetus in pieces, and then a vacuum cleaner to suck out the parts, just describing it very graphically, then that's called a surgical abortion because it does involve surgery. Typically, it's a combination of both, and you'll see when this happens. Starting early on, this is divided by trimesters. This diagram is divided by trimesters. In the first trimester, you have a manual vacuum or an electric vacuum, depending on how advanced the baby is, the embryo. And medical. So this one is, the typical drug that is used is mifepristone, which is also known in the market as RU-486. The RU comes from Russell Oclaf. Russell Oclaf is the pharmaceutical company that developed this drug, okay? And I think this is a reference to the number of trials or something like that. But that's Russell Oclaf developed this drug. I think they're from Switzerland, I'm not sure. But anyway, that essentially kills the baby, the tiny embryo or fetus, and at the same time causes the mother to go into contractions and expel the little embryo. As we go into the second trimester, the typical technique is called DNC. DNC dilation and curettage. These are sophisticated words. Dilation means that the cervix, which is now closed shut tight because inside the woman's uterus is the pregnancy developing, the cervix is that muscle closes shut tight, all right? That cervix has to be dilated, has to be opened artificially with instruments, and then go in, maintain it open with a series of clamps, and then a curette is a particular type of scalpel that is curved and extremely sharp, and will proceed to cut up the fetus into pieces. That's called curettage, is to curate, is to cut up into pieces. And then, of course, those pieces have to be sucked out onto a jar, and the nurse has to reassemble those parts to make sure that they got all the pieces out. You typically hear it as a DNC. That's what happens graphically. Into the second trimester, dilation and evacuation. Ironically, as the fetus develops further, the mother can be induced into early labor and pass the fetus intact. All right, so they will dilate the cervix and induce the woman to go into early labor and pass the fetus intact. But of course, that fetus to come out has to be dead. Otherwise, as soon as the fetus comes out, he or she becomes a legal person and has full protection of the law. So this gets very technical. And therefore, the abortionist has to make sure that this fetus is killed inside the womb before he or she comes out, all right? They do that in a number of ways. The typical way is they go into the heart of the fetus with a large bore needle that has potassium chloride or something like that, and they put the fetus into cardiac arrest. They kill the fetus inside the womb before because they have to make sure, otherwise if that fetus is born precisely, that law goes into effect, the Born Fetus Protection Act. All right, so they kill the fetus inside the womb. I mean, this has legal implications big time. An abortionist could lose his whole practice from one of these suits of a mother who wanted to have an abortion and the fetus was not killed. It's called wrongful death, wrongful birth, and that abortionist will be cleaned out of his practice or her practice. So they make sure that they kill that fetus before they proceed to extract the fetus or evacuate. Hysterotomy is to remove the entire uterus. Okay, sometimes there is a medical indication for hysterotomy. For example, where there is a cancerous uterus, and then at that point you have the principle of double effect kicking in, whereby the uterus is cancerous and needs quick action because that cancer will kill the mother if it continues to develop, which, by the way, the cancer on the uterus will also kill the child anyway, but because of the principle of double effect, now we have a pathology for the mother, a real actual pathology, which is a cancerous uterus. So under those circumstances, ethically, the doctor can go in and remove the entire uterus, okay? And that way, the fetus will die. There's no action directly on the fetus. It's very important not to act directly on the fetus, but actually to remove the entire uterus that is cancerous. And that way, then by double effect, the death of the fetus is foreseen, but it's not willed, because there is a life-threatening pathology to the mother that can be addressed clinically. Okay? Okay. Different, again, is another technique that is called intact dilation and extraction. That's the DNX. This is further into development. These fetus is just too large to be cut up into pieces and to be sucked out with a vacuum cleaner, okay? It's just too large. So the only option here is to extract the fetus whole. But what happens again, because they want to make sure that this fetus doesn't come out alive, they first introduce a needle into the head at this point, through the cranium into the head. They suck out the brain, and that fetus obviously dies. The brain collapses, the cranium collapses, and then it's much easier to pass through the birth canal of the mother with a collapsed cranium, all right? And that fetus is extracted, and that one's called DNX. And it's known as intact dilation and extraction, also known as partial birth abortion. Okay, Partial birth, because sometimes this fetus is so far along in the pregnancy, it's already in the 9th month, and the fetus is actually in the birth canal. All right? But as long as the fetus has not crowned, as long as the head is not out of the mother's body, that fetus has no protection under the law, because he or she is not a legal person. Anthropologically, there's no doubt, but no legal person. And you see the social schizophrenia that we're dealing with here. Okay?
So it's safe to say that in the United States, even up to the 9th month, someone could get an abortion.
Yes.
And now it's technically 8 full months because birth would happen at the end of the 8th month.
No.
At the end of the 9th month.
Oh, at the beginning.
I mean,
of the
at the
10th
beginning
and
of the
9th month.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It depends if you count, there's 2 weeks separation, if you count from first missed period, or if you count from going backwards to the actual fertilization, there will be a 2-week back and forth, okay?
So the next year, the dilation and extraction can happen in the 2nd trimester as well, or mostly in the 3rd trimester?
It's in the 3rd trimester,
It's in the 3rd.
because the body is larger, so that's when they collapse the cranium. I'm just trying to describe it as objectively as possible. This is gruesome, but this is the actual technique, because at that point, it's much easier for the woman to pass that fetus if the cranium is smaller. That's the largest part of the whole body. Okay.
You know, Father, a lot of the states, they have the rules for abortion has really changed from the 9 months.
Yes.
Some states have 5 weeks. Anything beyond 5 weeks cannot be done.
Okay. They need a medical indication, and they need the okay of a judge to do it.
After 5?
Yes.
Okay, so in a sense, it's just paper.
Yes. In the extreme, what happens in the extreme is that some states can become more restrictive than the federal law, but then what does the person do? The mother who really wants that abortion just goes to another state, gets the abortion, and comes back to her own state. Okay, so as long as some states have the abortion for 9 months, then the law is left that way. You see, because the woman has access somewhere in the United States. The idea is, of course, to close down all the abortion clinics, but as long as the woman has some access somewhere in the United States, then the law stays.
Question on the partial birth abortions, then
Yes.
the mother has to actually push that baby out, like if she's giving birth?
Well, she's induced, but she can maybe she has a epidural, but the labor is induced. Mm-hmm. Now, it would be an easier labor because the most difficult part, even as we saw graphically in that video, the most difficult part is the baby's head to come out. That's the maximum dilation there of the mother. After that, everything just flows very fast. Okay.
Just a quick review, Father. So
Yes.
0 to 12, what are the methods of abortion?
This is the first trimester.
Yeah.
Most abortions,
Yeah.
granted, are in the first trimester, okay?
Yeah.
Also because psychologically, after the first trimester, the mother is already identifying with that child. The mother may have seen a sonogram, the mother may have heard or have felt a kick or something, and she's saying, oh my God, the typical reaction of moms who see their sonogram for the first time, even in the first trimester, the typical reaction is, I didn't know it was that human. I didn't know it was that human. They become aware of the humanity of their child. But these are the techniques: the vacuum extraction, these are mechanical, or the medical abortion with mifepristone, which is a chemical that kills the child and induces an early labor, contractions. So this is a very fast overview of the different techniques that exist, the different methods by trimester. Okay, but the bottom line is that until the baby's head is not out of the body of the mother, that baby has no legal protection. If the mother wants, yes. So we have the incongruency of pregnant moms who are killed, for example, or are injured in a car accident or an actual injury. They can sue for 2 deaths. If the mom was intended to keep her pregnancy. If the mom was not intended to keep her pregnancy, then it's only 1 death, it's the death of the mother, okay? But if the mother was intending to keep her pregnancy, then they can sue for 2 deaths. a lot of inconsistency here, all because of the stubbornness of not accepting that human life begins at conception. Okay? Now, what are the challenges? Of course, the challenges are the unwanted pregnancies. It's not the wanted pregnancies that are being aborted. Okay? In fact, we're going to see in a few minutes the converse of, people wanting to get pregnant, couples wanting to get pregnant and can't. And that's the other flip of the coin. But the bottom line for alternatives, healthy alternatives to abortion, of course, is somehow to convince the mom to not kill her child, to keep her child, and to give her all of the support necessary. For example, at least in the state of Florida, I know that a mom, if she wants to keep her baby, the state will come in and pay, at least throughout the pregnancy, will pay for all the medical bills. Okay? So in that sense, we have a pro-life state through Children and Family Services. In fact, I have a cousin of mine who works in Children and Families, and she's telling me we get pregnant moms all the time, unwed moms, single moms. They want to keep their pregnancy. Well, the state comes in and pays for everything during their pregnancy. So financially, there is support. What needs to be is psychological, emotional support, that kind of thing, so that they don't feel, because first the first shock of an unwanted pregnancy, and then what to do with that pregnancy, considering all the propaganda, the publicity that is out there, that if you have a problem, just go to the abortion clinic and get rid of the problem. The other one, which I think is very courageous, is quite simply to give that baby up for adoption. There are thousands and thousands of couples in the United States who are financially secure, are loving couples, they are of good faith, they have good, solid education, and they cannot get pregnant. And they're dying to adopt, so much dying to adopt that they have to go to China to adopt, they have to go to Asia, they have to go to Latin America to adopt, because they cannot find babies here. All right? And so a very good and noble and selfless thing to do for a pregnant mom or now unwanted pregnancy is to just give that child for adoption. Give that child a chance, let him or her have life, and you continue with your own life, hopefully learning from the experience. But give the child for adoption. Of course, what happens is most moms, when they go through the pregnancy, they start bonding with that child. By the time they reach the 9 months, then they don't want to give up the child because they want the child. Okay? But either way, as long as we can give life to that child and support the pregnant mom in her distress, then we can do something about abortions. John? On the adoption issue?
What was that?
On adopting, on giving up for adoption.
Yeah. Is it safe to say that most, thank you. Is it safe to say that most pregnant mothers who don't want to keep the baby could actually line up a family ahead of time?
Yes, it depends on the agency.
Yeah. So that they could go forward with the pregnancy full faith, knowing that there's a accepting family that's ready to do
yes. Depending on the agency, but all that is worked out. They try to keep some anonymity on both sides, but even today, legally, even that biological mother, that's why it's becoming kind of risky to adopt today in the U.S. because that biological mother can still claim that baby later on.
Even later after.
Later, yes. Later on, until the baby becomes an adult, legally, that mom could go back and claim that baby and have second thoughts about putting up for adoption under the stress and all that. So adopting couples sometimes actually prefer to go outside of the U.S., even if they find a baby here, because of that possibility that that baby will then be taken away from them. So it's getting very, very complicated, very complicated.
On a short note on the awareness factor of the mom, as I had a friend who went through this adoption thing.
Yes.
He said that when the baby was born, they never showed the baby to the biological mom.
Right.
Because if she sees that baby, she's
not gonna let him go. Right. Right. That's the best thing. It's the best thing is to do it that way. Just you've made the decision, follow through. Your baby will be fine, will be well. In fact, some of the bonding already starts with knowing the sex of the child. And that's why, personally, I'm against if the doctor wants to know for some kind of medical or clinical reasons, fine, but I'm in the opinion that the couple should not know the sex of the child until the child is born. It's very difficult.
Why?
Because it's a surprise. Because it's an act of humility to trust in whatever God gives you. Whatever God gives you. I mean, what's the point? The anticipation of the child, you know, I'm just thinking, of course, as a celibate male who has never been married with children, I'm just thinking that it starts placing expectations on the kid to be a man or a woman, to be a boy or a girl, prematurely and subconsciously. And not only for the parents, because many times those are the ones who are going to be less at fault, but the extended family already is expecting a boy or a girl for months before the kid is born.
You know? It's my daughter put it another way, Father. She said, how long does it go take to put up a curtain? A pink or a blue curtain?
Exactly.
Oh, I need to know what now.
Yeah.
How long is it going to take to put up a curtain? Pink or blue?
What if the little girl wants a blue curtain?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Or you could go yellow, right? Exactly. So these are the cultural things, right, that we project on kids. So that's why I'm saying, I don't know, it just leaves the mystery further into God's hands, you know, whatever God wants. Anyway, most couples today, they're anxious to know, boy, girl, I don't know for what purpose, but then they set up accordingly. Exactly. To go shopping, to burn the plastic, as we say. You gotta burn that plastic.
She found out she was pregnant. And the father wanted to know, my son-in-law wanted to know the gender of the child. My daughter said to him, listen, I'll let you know still, because they actually can't tell the husband unless the mother permits it.
Right.
Yeah, that's
women's rights, it's in her body.
She looked at me and said, listen, if your mouth ever slip and the gender of this child comes out, I'm done with you. She was one divorce if it ever came out that it was a boy or girl.
Oh, yes?
Yes, so that's all that she said, no, I want this as a surprise. This is part of giving birth.
Very good. Wow.
And I'll take anything that comes. So you should do the same. When you want to know, I'll tell. But if your mouth ever slip, you're done, boy.
Very good. Interesting. No pressure.
So
you know who's
just
so that you know who's the boss in here.
You know what they say, you knew it was a boy coming, right? So every time you walk in a store, you have to go to both departments.
Yeah, exactly. Just for equal opportunity.
I said, you know what? I thought you were smart, but you're actually dumb. Because I don't know why you put this pressure yourself. You can't buy anything for the boy. You know, it's a boy. You can't buy it for the girl. And if you do, you better hide it. Right? So you have to wait 10 minutes. I don't see the big thing.
Very interesting dynamic that developed there. Huh?
Yes, yes.
Very interesting. Tremendous. Very special, very special. All pointing to the fact that this is really a very humbling mystery, you know, and we should try to leave it as such. Okay. Now, we're going to move into the converse, which is for couples who cannot get pregnant in the best case scenario, and but there's a technology that can help them get pregnant, okay? IVF. So let's move on this. Here we have IVF stands for in-vitro fertilization. And I want to do a little bit of thinking about IVF, follow through to what purpose? Why? Why the IVF, all right? By the word in vitro, meaning in glass originally, simply it's a reference to the lab or the clinic. Why? Because originally the glassware was all glass, was either Pyrex or Corex. In other words, it was glass that could be autoclaved, that could be sterilized and reused, okay? So that's why in vitro stuck, meaning in glass, when the glassware of the equipment in labs was actual glass. Today, it's all plastic. It comes sterile in a package, and the plastic is used and then discarded, disposable. So today, you know, this should be actually in plastico fertilization because it's all plastic, it's all sterilized. But in vitro has stuck, meaning to contrast it from in vivo, meaning in the body of the woman. So you got in vivo is a natural, normal, standard course, how the vast majority of us are conceived and given birth is in vivo. In other words, in the womb of our mothers. Whereas in vitro refers to having been manufactured in the lab. And I say manufactured on purpose because it's all about the technology. So, just at the human level, looking at some of the human dynamics of this, existentially, it is expensive and burdensome. I'm talking about, used to be $10,000, now it's about $20, $30, $40, $50,000, depending on how much quality control you want on that child, okay? So it's very expensive, not covered by insurance, so it's out of pocket, thank you very much. And it is burdensome physically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually is what I'm proposing. To what purpose? To have a child. What do we mean to have a child? Well, we can take to have a child at two levels. You know, at the superficial level, the couple wants to have a child. Father, you married us. You married us 10 years ago. We've been having intercourse every night, Father. We cannot get pregnant. What's going on? Can we use in vitro fertilization? This is the advancement of medical science. This is the ultimate good of the advancement of medical science. We can now finally have a child. Father, we promise each other to have children, to desire children. So to what purpose? To have a child. Okay. So there's a superficial level of having a child. We know what couples mean by that. You know, they want to have kids. But there's a deeper level of having a child as a possession, as a thing, as an object, as the thing that I manufactured in the lab because I want to have a child and I want it now. And it's about me having this child because I want it, and you know what? I can pay for it. And therefore, there is a possession involved in there, which makes it be subconscious, but very real. Okay, because I've dealt with enough of these couples to understand that there is an intensity about them, that they need to have this. So, where's the gift there, right? If I can just go shopping and procure the child. All right, so to be clear, the Catholic teaching is that it is only ethical to have a child within the context of marriage, a valid marriage. All right, so that automatically is going to exclude all the other possibilities that in vitro allows for, which is having a child out of wedlock, having a child because I'm a TV star, I'm a movie star, and I want to have a child, and I just buy the catalog, I just buy the sperm of the catalog, etc. There could be non-married couples, there could be single women or same-sex couples, any combination that you can think of, all right, that is not a valid marriage is not considered ethical, at least from the Catholic perspective, and this program is being taught from the Catholic perspective. Also, that includes carrying a child for another person, you know, what we call surrogate motherhood. And people call it normally rent a womb or surrogate motherhood, but this is now a woman who is carrying the pregnancy, will be impregnated through the in vitro process to carry the pregnancy of another woman, of another couple. Let's move a little further. Why within a valid marriage? Well, because we hold and believe that marriage has two dimensions, two essential dimensions. Specifically, the act of intercourse has two dimensions that are simultaneous, what we call the unitive and the procreative dimension of marriage, all right? And these two dimensions should go together in principle. They should be there. And therefore, every act of intercourse through the married couple should be open to these two dimensions of the married life. I'm going to delve more into this theology when I talk about natural family planning and when I talk about contraception, because it applies even more so there, all right? But you notice that with in vitro fertilization, there is the unitive without the procreative. In other words, the couple have their intercourse, with contraception. It precludes the procreative. With in vitro, it's the other way around. In vitro will do the procreative in the lab without the unitive, without the intercourse. In other words, in vitro fertilization, there is no need for intercourse. It's put aside. There is no need for intercourse, and a child is still being generated, but without the actual intercourse. Okay, so that's why I say that IVF is kind of the converse of contraception, because you have the procreative without the unitive. There is a separation there that is not for us to make that separation. That is artificial upon a vital process of procreation that involves the next generation. We did not design the way that human fertilization occurs, okay? We inherit that from being human. And so we don't have a right to change something that has been given to us from the inheritance of humanity as such, that belongs to all of humanity. So that's why I say that instead of being a procreation, it is a manufacture in the lab, because it's just using techniques to put together egg and sperm into a zygote. Now, this act of human procreation is both a natural act and it's a vital act. It's vital because it involves the next generation. It's not vital for the couple. In other words, if a couple has intercourse or doesn't have intercourse, they don't die for lack of intercourse, okay? But it's vital for the next generation, the way nature intended it. So these are arguments, a little philosophical, if you will, but you can think that when these are vital acts that involve the next generation, the way it was designed by God through nature, through the natural process of intercourse, what right do we have to go in and change that in a change that is going to affect natural selection? Because by manufacturing, by doing IVF in the lab, there's nothing natural about that process, right? It's not occurring in the ampulla. Therefore, it's not natural selection, but there is some selection going on, so it's artificial selection. So essentially what we're doing with IVF is we're doing artificial selection on the human population. We're doing artificial selection on the human population, and these babies, these IVF embryos, the expectation is what? The expectation is that they grow, be born, and grow more, and marry, and produce their own families, either through the natural course or through IVF, right? But the expectation is that these embryos become part of the social fabric of humanity. And yet they were manufactured through IVF. So natural selection was denied on those embryos without their knowledge and without their approval. They are denied natural selection because they are the product of an artificial selection without ever consulting for their consent. How can they consent, right? Okay, so they are being imposed the injustice of bypassing natural selection. Okay? Again, just to recap, you've seen this diagram, you know the natural process, how it should occur. What happens? IVF bypasses the process of natural selection, okay? Of those, also, I think I had it in one of the slides, but I did not comment on it. We as a human species, as Homo sapiens, we have one of the highest rate of spontaneous abortion and miscarriage in nature, okay? It's anywhere from 25 to 50%, and in some reads that I did actually went up to 60 and 70%, depending on who you read and how they count it. It's a little fussy because how do you get an actual grip on the number of spontaneous abortions and miscarriages that happen in the human population? In some countries, it's much more accurate than in other countries. You know, some countries will just simply not measure that. But it's estimated that globally, we can say about 50% is a global figure. What am I saying? I'm saying that in the human species, okay, on average, about 50% of human pregnancies do not make it to term. naturally, or aborted spontaneously, or miscarried naturally. Again, no wrongdoing there, no guilt. It's just a natural process of natural selection. The vast majority of those embryos have some kind of defect. So we can put the figure globally at about 50%. It's rather high. Half of all the pregnancies in the world end up in a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage naturally. That's a very high rate of selection. So there's here a double selection, if you will, on the child. Think about this. First, I talked about the selective pressure against sperm, right? Because I mentioned that a competent ejaculate, clinically speaking, is to have anywhere from 100 to 150 million sperm. And yet it only takes one to fertilize that one egg. And so the selective pressure against the sperm is on average about 100 million to 1. That's an incredibly large, that's tremendous. The chances are of not fertilizing, if you look at it just statistically, okay? And so, on average, that sperm, just recapping, is going to be the most competent, the strongest, the most vigorous, the best sperm possible to reach that egg on average, because it is competing with the whole other gang of the 100 million, okay? In IVF, that is denied to that child, to that zygote. So that zygote is not necessarily the most competent, the most vigorous zygote that could result from the fertilization from that competent sperm, okay? So that's an injustice there that is built into in vitro that people normally don't talk about. You talk to the clinicians, you talk to the medical doctors about that fundamental injustice, they have no clue of what we're talking about. And yet, they're clinicians. They should know about the statistics. They should know about natural selection. I'm not mentioning God, faith, or religion at all. I'm talking about nature. That's the first injustice. The second injustice is because on average, half of the pregnancies do not succeed in the human being, in the human species, right? That second process of what happens there in that first week, going through that fallopian tube and implanting, is also denied. So it's a second level of injustice of that other 50% of that implanting that is denied to that in vitro baby, because they will continue to throw embryos in there until one takes, until one implants. So they're again bypassing that natural selective process, okay? These are built-in injustices to the system, and because of those things, we can say that IVF really, at the end of the day, is intrinsically evil from the bioethical analysis, because it totally bypasses the natural process, which in this case, because it is a vital process, is a grave injustice that is being forced upon these in vitro babies. Okay, John, you had a question or comment?
Yes, so when they do the artificial, well, not artificial insemination,
Correct.
That's different.
Correct. I'll talk about insemination in a minute.
So
right.
in vitro fertilization,
right.
It's just they actually take one single sperm, or they take a bunch. And
sometimes they do in the extreme. It's called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. It's in here somewhere, the word. Okay, ICSI. What happens is this. So the standard procedure is they will collect. So these are, thank you, because this is a good segue actually into the considerations of practice. So there's the bioethical rejection of in vitro fertilization on two levels, at the level of principle and at the level of practice. At the level of principle, because is that denial of the fundamental justice of every fertilization, every human fertilization going through natural selection process, okay? So that we could be the best, the most normal. That's why most of us when we're born were normal, because the abnormals got selected out. Now, in practice, let's look at the considerations of practice that are also offensive to an ethical analysis. And one of them is that, we'll get to that one, the actual procedure, all right? So if we go step by step, what happens to the mother? The mother is given a fertility drugs to make her hyperovulation. In other words, to mature several eggs at once. on her cycle instead of just a single egg. The typical drug that has been used for decades now is called Clomid or some kind of analog, but essentially what it does is it fools the ovary, it overstimulates the ovary into maturing more than one follicle. Remember, the follicles are in there and they're in a rested state on the meiosis. So typically, when an ovary is hyperstimulated, okay, into what is known as hyperovulation, the woman will mature 6, 8, 10, 15, 20, 30 eggs at one time. That ovary becomes like this, it looks like a melon, okay? I have another cousin who works at South Miami Hospital. She's a caseworker, social worker, and she tells me, Alfred, because the Baptist system has a very profitable in-vitro system, by the way. It says all the time women are coming in here with their ruptured ovaries. It's a very dangerous and risky situation because when the ovary is not meant to be the size of a melon, all right? And if that ovary ruptures, the woman goes into massive hemorrhage and she can die from hyperovulation. It's a very dangerous and painful thing for the woman to do. So that's the first risk. In other words, the woman, by hyperovulation, is risking her life for a process that is not a vital process to herself. In other words, if she doesn't have a child, she doesn't die for lack of a child, okay? So it's not that she needs to have this process in order to save her life. There's no justification ethically for risking her life this way for something that she wants, but it's not essential for her livelihood. All right, so that's the first offense there. On the part of the man, the easiest way to collect the sperm is by masturbation, which again is an immoral act because it's selfish and it's just about himself and it's not within the context of the intercourse. So that's the easiest way to collect the sperm, and that's what typically happens. There are these bathrooms where men go and they masturbate and then they sell their sperm to the clinic, which puts it on the catalog. And then that clinic will put on the catalog everything about that man except for his name and his address. They'll put his age, his physique, his intellectual capacity, his IQ, his degrees, his athletic fitness, because it's selection. You're doing artificial selection. So just like you're selecting the best chicken in the market, you know.
That's how they breed racehorses.
Yes, it is. It's a breeding. It's called eugenics. This is called eugenics, you know, but it's done with the highest standard of clinical expertise and sophisticated equipment because it's all microscopic. But it really is the purification of the race. It's called eugenics, all right? All right, so this is what goes on in the clinic. Of course, the clinic is painted very pretty and it's all about the baby pictures that are seen in the foyer. They don't see what's in the backside of the clinic, the couple, I mean. All right, then when implantation fails, so they will extract 1, 2, or 3 dozen eggs from the woman. They insert a needle either transvaginally or typically transvaginally, a long bore needle, large bore, and extract those eggs. So now they have 1, 2, or 3 dozen eggs of the woman in a Petri dish, actually a container in the lab, in a nutrient that simulates the nutrient environment of the inside reproductive tract of the woman. Then they collect the sperm and they mix it together. That's in the cheapest process. But you want to do a little more selection than that. Typically what they do is they clean the sperm, they wash the sperm. It's called sperm washing or semen washing. They centrifuge the sperm. And then subthinction gets in there with microscopes and selects out what he or she thinks are the best sperm, you know. Do you think that this technician has the sophistication to pull out the absolutely best sperm of the 100 million sperm that are there? No, it's just a mechanical process of centrifuging. And so that's where the denial of the natural selection kicks in, all right? And so some of those sperm then is used for fertilization. They also have some sperm, catalog sperm that historically is very potent, very competent. So these men, they're super studs, you know, they have very competent sperm. And so their sperm sells in many clinics throughout the United States because they have very competent, strong sperm, all right? So again, it's on the catalog and there's a price for it. What happens? When those eggs are fertilized, they're let in that incubation stage for 3 to 5 days in the clinic, and then they have to be implanted because then otherwise they overgrow the blastocyst. If the blastocyst continues to grow without the nourishment that it needs, it will lead up its amniotic sac and it's a yolk and needs more nourishment, needs to establish a placenta. So if those little blastocysts are not implanted within 3 to 5 days, they will die, okay? So some are implanted. Typically, they use 3 or 4. No one knows exactly why, the magic of that number, but on average, when 3 or 4 are inserted, 1 actually implants. That's the statistical average, okay? It may have gotten better now, I don't know, but that was the average that I was hearing. They would take 3 or 4 of the blastocysts and insert them into the uterus, and then on average, 1 will implant. What happens to the other 2 or 3? They're discarded. And those are discarded embryos. That's an abortion. Now, one could say, well, that's a spontaneous abortion. But it's not spontaneous in the sense that there's nothing natural about this process. Spontaneous abortion only happens in nature. There's nothing natural about this process. So it's not a spontaneous abortion. It's a procured abortion. It's an abortion that one way or another had to be willed because you cannot not will. If you insert 3 embryos with the hope that 1 implants, you cannot but will that the other 2 will be discarded, okay? So therefore, there are abortions involved in the failed implantations, and those are procured abortions. At least on the part of the clinician and the technician, because they know what they're doing. The couple really, they don't have typically the sophistication of knowing these procedures. If they did, they wouldn't do it. The ones that are not implanted are frozen because beyond 3 to 5 days, those little blastocysts will die, okay? So let's assume for the sake of argument that there were a dozen eggs that were fertilized, so now we have a dozen embryos, okay? 4 were implanted, 4 were inserted, 1 actually took. So now mom has her pregnancy and she's continuing with that pregnancy. They go home happy. The test is positive for pregnancy and they're moving along in the pregnancy. What happened to the other 8? Well, the other 8 were frozen. They were dipped in liquid nitrogen, which has a temperature of minus 170 centigrade. It's minus 200 and something, 280 degrees Fahrenheit, more or less, minus liquid nitrogen. What happens? Whenever you put anything into liquid nitrogen, it crystallizes instantly, okay? I don't know if you've ever seen there's a little video of a rose, beautiful red rose that is fresh and beautiful and is dipped in liquid nitrogen. You pull it out and after the fume evaporates, the rose looks identical, fresh, beautiful. And then this fellow taps it like this and it shatters into smithereens. It just shatters because it was crystallized. All right, super cold. Well, that's what happens to these embryos. They are crystallized solid, all right, and they go into what is known as suspended animation. Why suspended animation? They're not dead in liquid nitrogen. They're cryopreservation, okay? They're preserved in high cold. And they are not dead because when they're thawed, some of them actually survive the freezing and the thawing process. And when they're thawed, they can be implanted and take, and 9 months later, a baby comes out. So it's not that frozen blastocyst died, bless you, and came back to life. You know, the frozen blastocyst had to stay alive through that cryopreservation process. And we call it suspended animation, because there's no coming back from the dead, not physiologically. Now I'll give you a little example of an experiment that I did when I was studying biology at FIU, doing my bachelor's in biology years before I was thinking about the priesthood. I think I shared I wanted to be a marine biologist back then, so I was just studying biology at FIU bachelor's. And one time I did an experiment with bees. You know that you can take bees from the back, live bees, as long as you get the 4 little wings together, you clip them together with your fingers, the abdomen does not have the capacity to turn around 180 degrees and sting you, okay? It can only sting toward the front. So you can grab a bee that is on a flower gently from the back of the wings quickly, all right? And you got the bee. Now, what do you do with the bee? Well, the bee has a stinger. And so you put a little saliva on your clothes, on the cloth, all right, on the shirt or something, and you pass the bee by that warm, moist area, the bee will sting. But the sting of the bee is like a hook. It has a barb, all right, and so it gets stuck. You can pull the bee and the sting will stay on the clothing. Don't do it on your skin, do it on the clothing. And so the sting will come off the bee. All right, so now you have the bee and doesn't sting anymore, and you can play with the bee. That bee eventually is going to die because what happens when that little stinger breaks off, with the stinger breaks off, it will take a little tiny piece of the abdomen, and the bee will eventually die from an infection. It breaks off the intestine or the backside of the abdomen. But this is an experiment, and the experiment was this: I took some bees, took out their sting, I have them in their hands, and put them in a jar, and I put the jar in the freezer. And I let those bees freeze several hours. I go back several hours later, pull out the jar, and here are the frozen bees. They're all crumbled up like this, you know, all curled up, frozen bees. I laid them out on the top of the counter and let them thaw passively back to room temperature, passively. Half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever it took, just stand there or go do something else, come back later, and not all, but most of the bees were walking around. And then give it a little more time, and some of those that were walking around start flying around. They were alive. So what happened in the freezer? They went into suspended animation, okay? And so when animals are small enough, they can be cryopreserved. And that's what happens with the human blastocyst when he or she is dipped into liquid nitrogen. Now, some don't survive the process, and the thawing process, many of them die, but some survive. It's a numbers thing. That's why they do the hyperovulation, because they have excess of the product available, okay? They have excess of the product that was manufactured at the lab, who happens to be a human being. More injustice. Did this blastocyst ever consent to be frozen, to be cryopreserved? There was the news the other day, precisely some reporter came to do a report with me from Univision, because they heard of a lady who was 25 years old, and she went through IVF, and she consented to have an embryo implanted into her who was 25 years old. The embryo had been frozen for 25 years. The embryo had been frozen so here is this mom, or this embryo, this child has the same age as the mom, right? Because she was cryopreserved 25 years ago. And her mom was gestating her, or since she was born already, and the news came out several months after the baby was born and all this, you know, so they can claim the whole success. The daughter is the same age as the mother, but it's her baby, okay? Because she was cryopreserved for 25 years. This industry actually is from 1971. I don't know if the name Louise Brown means anything to you, but Louise Brown was the first test tube baby back in 1979. She was manufactured in 78 in the lab by two doctors, Steptoe and Edwards from Great Britain. And then she was born in 79, and she was the first test tube baby, okay? And she came out in all the magazines, Time magazine, and all the journals of the world at that time, 1979, Louise Brown. Eventually she grew up, and she herself married and had children, so that was the proof, the final proof, biological, that it had worked, is when she had her own babies naturally, because she was a fertile adult. She became a fertile adult having been manufactured in vitro in the lab. So the embryos that are not used in that first implantation are thawed. Why? Because going back to the hypothetical scenario of the 12 embryos that were generated and 1 implanted, the other 3 were aborted, and then other 8 were cryopreserved, right? This mom went to her home with her husband, and after 2 months, she lost her pregnancy. She lost her pregnancy. So now what? She goes back to the clinic. They pull out 4 more from the 8. They pull out 4 more, thaw them. Maybe 3 make it, maybe 2 make it, whatever make it. They implant those. And now, guess what? Now 2 implants. Okay? So now she's got 4 that are still cryopreserved, 1 that died along the pregnancy. All the others were aborted, but now she's pregnant with twins. Okay? But she only wanted 1, and they only negotiated with 1, and they only have one child. They only want to have 1 child. No problem. Now they can do what is known as selective reduction. These are euphemisms that are used in the lingo in the industry to diminish the culpability. What does selective reduction means? Well, you have 2 embryos, but you only want 1. No problem. We will reduce 1 of them. We will kill and extract 1 of them, and you keep the one you want. By the way, it's 1 boy and 1 girl, so you can choose the sex. So you all know we want a boy because the boy has to be, the first one has to be a boy, and so the girl goes out. That is called selective reduction in the language, in the culture of IVF.
Are we far enough along where, I don't think we are, but where we could actually take the DNA of each of those and test?
Very much so. Already. Oh, for decades. It's called prenatal diagnosis.
And they'll take
they'll
do the whole genome.
Yes, they can do the genome, and they can find out chromosomal abnormalities. It's becoming more and more. They can map the genes to where there is a predisposition for certain anomalies later on in life as a percentage, as a possibility.
They already do that for decades.
Yes.
And then you have the option of keeping the baby or not if you want them.
Exactly. So you can do the eugenics on the baby.
Chromosomes, I know they did that, but
yeah.
I mean, we only mapped the genome in 2000, so it's been,
Exactly, but a lot has happened since, yes. Yeah. Individual genes had already been mapped, Right. It's the whole genome in situ, in place, in the location. That's why CRISPR is also so two-edged sword, because now it's in location, right?
So now we can make as many LeBron James as we want.
It's getting there. It's getting there. And there is selection. There is prenatal selection, right? And it's based on the genetics and the predispositions and the mother's standard. The doctor has to offer it precisely because abortion is legal. If the baby is born with an anomaly and the doctor didn't tell me that I had the possibility of doing the prenatal diagnosis, the doctor is suable. And so they offered it as a standard. And that's part of the culture, it's part of the language, all stemming from the legalization of abortion. So you see the injustices that are being built in here, all right? It also generates these frozen human embryos that are becoming excess, and they're called spare embryos, in quotations, because these are spare human beings. I mean, am I spare? Are you a spare person? Are you a spare human being? These are spare embryos that are in the clinics. And of course, what happens, again, the industry works this way. Couples can maintain their embryos, their frozen embryos, at a price, because this is a market economy, and they have to pay a monthly fee, $100, $200, depending on the quality of the clinic and so forth, the sophistication. Let's say it's $100 a month. Let's say it's $50 a month. They have to keep paying that, okay? How long are they going to pay for those spare embryos? $100 a month, $50 a month translates into $6,000 a year. $6,000 a year, in 10 years, that's $60,000 for maintaining those embryos cryopreserved. At some point, the couple, they have their baby is growing, their baby is healthy, they move away, they're gone beyond, so they tend to abandon those embryos. Now, what does the clinic do with those embryos? They're accumulating embryos and embryos. This industry has been going on for 35, 40 years. And over the years, it's estimated that about 1 million embryos are frozen in vitro clinics in the United States alone, in the United States. About 1 million frozen human embryos that the industry didn't know what to do with them, okay, until they figure out another commercial venue because the parents essentially walk away. What are you gonna, you're gonna sue the parents? It's not good PR for the other couples that are trying to come in. It will scare other couples from coming into the business. So the industry, the IVF industry, has to find another venue. They can just flush them down the toilet or throw them in the garbage. This is one of the industries that has the least regulations, government regulation, because it's all private. There's no federal money. There's no insurance money involved. It's all cash or credit, whatever. But it's a very unregulated industry. And so basically, those embryos are the property of the clinic. See, the couple signs a contract, and evidence of that is that when the couple divorces, they fight for the embryo. Just like they fight for the car and the house and the other property and other things they have, they also fight for the embryos. Because the embryos, as far as the law is concerned, they're also property. Okay? So if they're property, they belong to somebody, and the clinic owns them. When the parents abandon them, the clinic owns them. What does the clinic do? Typically, they throw them away, but if not, now they have found another venue for those embryos, which is to give them to research labs, so that they can extract the embryonic stem cells. Because the embryonic stem cells come from the ICM. The ICM, those are the embryonic stem cells, the inner cell mass, okay? And so what happens is, of course, the clinic has to donate these embryos because they're human embryos and cannot traffic with, they cannot sell the embryos, okay? It's against the law. So they donate the embryos. But the clinic is entitled to being compensated for their expenses. That's not selling, that's just being compensated for the expense of having first done the in vitro fertilization, then maintain those embryos cryopreserved for X number of years with all the sophisticated technology. $50,000, thank you very much. That's what it has cost me to maintain those embryos for these years. And so the labs will willingly give the $50,000 or whatever it is, because now they can experiment, now they have a source of embryonic stem cells to do the research and to get the grants, because the grant is going to be $1 million grant. And so it justifies the paying for the embryos. And in fact, we're trafficking with humans, all right? But that's what's going on. The clinic legally donates the embryos, but they're entitled to the compensation, and they set the price. That's how the industry works, okay? Does any of this get to the couple? Absolutely not. All right, so one of the biggest offenses, as I've mentioned before, is this whole issue of denying that embryo natural selection at every step of the way. I mentioned about the miscarriage on human pregnancies. Oh, there's another point at the social level. You see, these embryos are being denied the natural selection, of obviously at their individual level, and also at the family level, because this family is not receiving the best possible baby that they would receive otherwise, naturally. I mean, there's a reason why this couple is not getting pregnant here and now, okay? There's a complex psychological and biological reason why this particular couple is not getting pregnant here and now. And those are important reasons to consider. At any rate, I say that there is also an injustice of natural selection at the social level. Why? Because these in vitro babies at some point will grow and become adults and form part of the social fabric. And they're passing on whatever genes they have are being part of the gene pool. So in a very real biological sense, they are weakening the human species. You know, because they're not the best possible individuals, genetically speaking, that they could have been through a natural selection process. It sounds crass and gross, but it's a social reality. And what right do they have to deny natural selection to the species as a whole? Okay. Interesting issues, right? It takes the argument to another level, which is not being considered because it's strictly a market economy. If I can fake with a procedure, give it to me, thank you very much, because the technology is available. So, what do we have? We have that human fertilization, human procreation is extremely complex, okay? At many different levels. Any of you ever heard of the case of the couple who couldn't get pregnant for so many years, and finally they either did the in vitro or they adopted, but now they have baby at home, so they're no longer worried about getting pregnant, and 6 months later, she's pregnant. Any of you heard that case before?
Yeah.
All the time. So where was that supposed infertility? It was in the mind, because they were looking for that baby too intensely, you know? And that actually was blocking them from getting pregnant. Now that they're not thinking about pregnancy anymore because they really thought that they were not fertile, it happens, okay? So human procreation is extremely complex. The converse of that is the fertility rate in the United States. I'm gonna go over for a few minutes again. I apologize, but I hope you appreciate the importance of this. The fertility rate in the United States is about 10 to 12%. What does that mean? That on average, right now, okay, of the women who are in their fertile years, anywhere, we can say approximately the cohort of women in the United States right now that are between 10 and 40, approximately, years of age, okay, the fertile years. About 10 to 20% of them are pregnant right now, okay? That's the fertility rate. That's how it's measured. All right, so the fertility rate in the US is between 10 and 12% at the global level. Let's take the particular case of rape, the horrible situation of rape and the grave injustice that is being posed on the woman as a victim of rape. Some women get raped and they're in their fertile period and they get pregnant, okay? But the fertility rate of women of rape is anywhere from 1 to 5%, depending on how you measure, because again, it's not as easy to determine if a rape was a bona fide rape or a claimed rape, but she actually had consented, etc. But without getting into those details, at maximum, it will be 4 or 5% on the literature. In other words, is half, less than half of the national average. What is that saying? That psychologically, because that woman is obviously rejecting that imposition of the rape, of the aggression, not only is she physically rejecting that, mentally rejecting that imposition, but her body is also rejecting the sperm of the aggressor. Her body is also, in the moment of the rape, her body is adverse, is antagonistic to that sperm. In a very complex biochemical mechanism, it's not understood, but we see the statistics. And so you can see that psychologically, the whole issue of human procreation is very complex. It's very, very complex, okay? And therefore, we need to leave it alone. We need to leave it in God's hand. There's a reason why this couple is infertile or is not having a baby at this particular time in their marriage. There's a very important, sophisticated reason why, okay? And so, again, forever is going to be that contrast. Either a utilitarian mentality of, because technology allows me to do it, I can pay for it, and I can get it, or a little humility that really we, the couple, are involved in an act of procreation. In other words, there's a creation going on here. And that creation has to have a creator. And we're not really the creators, we're the facilitators. But it is God who is creating. So the little humility of accepting, if one accepts the existence of God, then one also has to accept the sovereignty of God of creating a human life if and when he wants the couple to have a human life. I know it takes a lot of humility and for couples to accept that, but truly that would be the position, in contrast to having a right to a child, is the privilege. And in fact, the couple, when they married, it's not that they made a vow to have children, because if the children come or not, it truly is up to God. They made a vow to desire children. The promise is to desire children, okay? And so the will of God, to accept the will of God, truly that God always wants what is best for each one of us. Only God knows why this couple right now is not having that child, okay? But it is really for their best interest at this time in their marriage. And I always qualify temporarily at this time of their marriage, because we never know if tomorrow or next year or next month they're going to get pregnant. Okay? But they're dealing with that infertility, which is very heartbreaking and very intense. So when we look at the vows of marriage, what they actually promise, how they exchange the matrimony, how they actually exchange the sacraments. As ministers, they administer the sacrament to one another. They said, you know, in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love and honor you all the days of my life. In there is nowhere that it says, I have to have a child, or you have to have a child, or you have to give me a child. Okay? And that's the sickness and the health. So it's this little phrase, which is said very fast, is extremely humbling, and it's an act of surrender, of mutual surrender to God's will. And that's the challenge. And I can tell you, as a priest for over 32 years in the Archdiocese of Miami and a bioethicist, okay, people come to me from all over the place. And one of the hardest things I've ever had to say to a couple, you don't have a right to a child. You have a right to desire the child. But whether the child comes or not is the prerogative of God. So try to reflect a little bit on the apparent silence, what I call the apparent silence of God in this aspect of their marriage. Okay? The apparent silence of God in this aspect of their marriage, because God can also speak volumes in that silence. Very challenging, but true and real, and that's why this industry is thriving. Because like I said to you, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. In fact, Edwards and Steptoe, the two clinicians who invented this procedure, eventually got the Nobel Prize in medicine, which is the highest standard in the practice and in among scientists. You know, the ultimate goal here on Earth is to get a Nobel Prize. And look at the damage that they have done to humanity. Two men who invented this procedure, in-Vitro fertilization, because they wanted to help couples to have children. Of course, the intention, we don't question the intention, but the actual event itself. A little bit like Margaret Sanger, which I'll touch on next when we get to contraception. She was intent on getting women to avoid pregnancy, but she went the utilitarian way until she got Pincus and the other fellow, John Rock, who was a practicing Catholic, to invent the pill. All right.
Was a practicing Catholic?
Yeah, John Rock was a daily communicant. And in fact, I'll tell you that story when we get to contraception. It will open your eyes like this. But so this is what we have with IVF, okay?
Catholics always seem to be the problem.
Exactly. I will never question the good intention of all these people.
Yes.
The couple who wants to have the child, the clinician who wants to give them the child, and the whole industry that lives on it. But behind the scene, you see that there is manipulation upon manipulation, and the one who is absolutely not considered in this whole situation is the little embryo. Yeah. Okay, who is being cryopreserved, who is being given to labs for research, who is flushed down the toilet. And where are the natural rights of this? Where did this child consent to any of this? Well, it gets even worse when they're born and they grow up. And I'll tell you a case about this man who had very potent, competent sperm in the Midwest. As you know, these clinics are far and wide because everything is spread out in the Midwest. I did my second doctorate in genetics at Purdue, which is in Indiana. All you see there is corn, and when you don't see corn, you see soybean to the horizon, flat. Okay, so what happens? There was this small community of African couples that lived there, young and thriving and doing well, and so forth. And one couple was not getting pregnant, so they went to the local clinic and they got this in-Vitro fertilization by sperm donor, because they had done the background check and his sperm didn't have competent sperm, the husband. So the wife ended up getting sperm from a catalog with a very competent semen from this one man. And of course, they had the baby was born, the couple was happy, and they shared that with their other couples in the town. And it turns out that another couple also had a difficulty, and guess what? It was also on his side. So they went to the same clinic and also ordered the sperm, but unbeknownst, they're getting the same sperm. And several of these couples are actually getting inseminated by the same sperm of the same donor. Okay, but they don't know about it each other, and certainly they're not telling their kids that they're in vitro kids, because the vast majority of couples don't tell their children that they're in vitro. Okay, they're growing up and they're getting to know each other, and these boys and girls are getting to know each other, and they're teenagers and they're falling in love, and they're marrying, and they're half brothers and half sisters because they come from the same sperm. So the injustices that are built into the system are bewildering. So these men, these stud men that sell their sperm, they have hundreds of children out there.
There's a movie about that.
Yeah.
It's a Hollywood movie.
Yeah.
About something like the privacy of one man, like
it's blown. It got out. Yeah.
And all of these kids, like 500, or like 100, or like 100, started looking for the dad and found the guy, and then
The other same guy.
yeah.
I read that story, y'all. The story.
Yeah.
Yeah, your story. That's what it
You
was.
see? It was. It's this is not fake news, guys. This is real news, okay? It makes us shudder because of this industry that had the best intentions, for sure. We never questioned that intention, but at some point, where do we stop? Where do we stop with the technology? That's where bioethics comes in. Yeah. It's not that we can do it. Should we do it? Should we do it is the question. And therefore, that's why I said at the very beginning, no. Why? Because this is how it should happen. We have no right to diverse from this, because this is natural selection. This is what God really has intended through the plan of nature over millions of years of evolution into the species that we are. Okay, thank you very much. You've been very patient with me again. And so I'll end here. And as always, review summaries by Wednesday midnight. I'm starting to discount points now, folks. I'm going to leave it in the recording. Starting to discount a little bit of points for late reviews, okay, late summaries. So please stay on track, because as you can see, this is only accumulating week after week. It's going to be a lot of material if you keep leaving it behind, all right? Thanks again. Great to see you. Have a beautiful weekend, and I'll see you next Saturday.
Thank you, Father.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Are you going to send us